칼 섹서 교수님을 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다.
First, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be here today. I'm not certain I have anything interesting to say, but I do hope to let you know my opinion. My first visit to Korea was in 1989. I have since then been here for 14 years. And in those years, I've had opportunity to be a witness to numerous demonstrations. In fact, at one point, I was chased down Chungno by a number of farmers who felt I was American in connection with the beef protests. But what struck me by the current candlelight demonstration we saw was the peacefulness. I was lucky enough to be the witness to it several times, as it was closely located to one of my favorite places in Seoul, Gyeobo-mungo. And what struck me was this feeling of community, that everybody came together for 20 weeks in the cold, holding up candles in the hope of achieving what really was a political goal. And we had masses of people there. And we're not only talking about students demonstrating, farmers demonstrating against liberalization of the agricultural sector. No. We had people from all the social classes, gender background, ages, all coming together with one main demand: that the sitting president step down or be removed. Now, these demonstrations had a massive impact also in the political arena. And on December 2nd, we then had the main opposition parties in the National Assembly suggesting an impeachment motion. The vote was then held on December 9th, passing overwhelmingly. And the demonstration continued every Saturday while the Constitutional Court went about its business. Then on March 10th this year, broadcast live, with probably a significant proportion of the South Korean population, myself included, sitting in front of the televisions, listening to the Constitutional Court reaching its judgment. And it led to the removal of a sitting president. Now, this is not the first time we have seen attempts at removing a sitting president. We had an attempted impeachment of Roh Moo-hyun in 2004. And I was present in Korea at that point. At some point also sitting out in the National Assembly in the audience seat, watching what was going on. And the contrast between the two procedures were immense. The procedure in 2004 was messy. There was infighting, there was sitting in the National Assembly, and there was massive resistance against the idea itself from a significant part of the population and also the Assembly members. The process, on the other hand, in 2016, 2017 was peaceful, orderly. Something I firmly believe speaks to the firmer consolidation of democracy in Korea, a higher respect also for the rules, laws, and regulations that governs how politics is supposed to function. Now, in 2004, the Constitutional Court came down and decided the sitting president, and the sitting president then retook his constitutional powers, in contrast to the events in 2017. Now, democratization itself in Korea, of course, is the result of people demanding change. In June 1987, we had a precarious standoff between people demonstrating downtown Seoul and many other places, demanding change, demanding democracy, demanding the right to freely, democratically elect their president. And ever since then, we repeatedly, and I consider this removal of the sitting president that we just went through as the last firm evidence. We have repeatedly seen that when civil society groups work together, when they appeal to the people and generate significant public support, we can actually see even legislative change, with the political arena also taking the demands seriously. So I see the successful removal of the president as evidence of the consolidation of South Korean democracy. But I also firmly believe there are still a number of issues that need to be dealt with. That we can't just sit around and shine in the light of the candles, but that we need to move on, dealing with some of the still important, outstanding issues that needs to be dealt with. And among those issues is constitutional change. The other is the granted now less serious, at least taking the recent election as evidence, the regional voting pattern. The third is then the volatile adversarial political landscape. There's no real tradition when it comes to compromises among the political parties present in the National Assembly. And the last one is then the increasing public lack of interest in traditional politics. Less than 1% of Korean citizens are members of political parties. And the status, the image of politicians when surveys are done are among the lowest on the ranking list. Now, in my opinion, President Moon has correctly emphasized the need for constitutional change. In fact, it's now 30 years since the Constitution was written. After we had the June 29th declaration by Notau, we then had about 3 months of negotiation, compromises reached when it came to writing a new constitution. And the reality, of course, is that many of those people who were part of that process did not necessarily expect the current constitution to last as long as it did. The main issue when it came to a new constitution was to achieve direct election of the president. The expectations then were by pretty much all the major opposition politicians at that point was that the people would elect an opposition candidate, and then many of the outstanding issues would then be able to deal with at that point. Now, we all know, of course, what happened. A divided opposition in the fall of 1987 led to the ruling regime basically continuing, not anymore under Chun Doo-hwan, but under his successor. And there are a number of issues that need to be dealt with when it comes to potential constitutional change. We, for instance, have simple plurality when it comes to election outcome. President Moon, while getting significant support among the people, only did get 41% of the votes, meaning that close to 60% of those who voted for somebody else. Any type of constitutional change to remedy that might take into account a French system, whereby we would have a runoff election between those two candidates getting the most votes, thereby ensuring that whoever wins the election also does achieve a majority of the votes. We also have a system where the president is sitting for a single term, a 5-year term, that unfortunately give rise to a significant period in which the president is considered a lame duck, where focus has shifted from the sitting president and towards those who potentially can run in the upcoming election. Now, the current president, of course, had significant small amount of time to get into the role and establish his administration. But the reality, of course, is that modern politics is complicated and the appointment process can take significant time. So the first 6 to 9 months of a 5-year period, a new incoming president and administration might not necessarily have everybody in place they need in order to govern efficiently. If we then take into account also that the last year, when attention as such shifts towards who will be the next president, we have at most maybe 3 to 3.5 years where the president has the opportunity to actually govern. In a modern society, that's way too little time. Hence, any constitutional change might need to take into account the suggestion also raised by the sitting president of changing the Constitution, maybe going away from a 5-year single term to maybe a 4-year term with the potential for re-election. Now, surveys indicate that there is significant support for constitutional change, but there's no real consensus of what should be the outcome of that change. In the run-up to the last presidential election, pretty much all the major candidates agreed that some type of constitutional change was seen as necessary, and there were even suggestions for some type of vote in the summer of 2018. Unfortunately, as often is the case, this disagreement has ceased, and there's now increasing disagreement on not only the schedule of constitutional revision, but also the contents of a new constitution. The sitting president wants to retain a presidential system, introduce a 4-year term with the potential for re-election, while a number of the opposition want a system that is more a combination, a dual executive parliamentary system, where more powers are shared with the National Assembly than currently is. So there's no real consensus on how a new constitution should look. And taking into account the adversarial relationship between the main parties in the National Assembly, there's probably only very few hopes of seeing some type of vote on constitutional change by the summer of 2018, unfortunately. One of the problems is the political landscape. Most political parties in South Korea are rather recent creations. In fact, it's very fluent. Of the current 7 parties present in the National Assembly, 4 of them who have enough seats to be floor negotiation groups, none of them can be traced back more than about 20 years. So this political party landscape we take for granted in much of the West, where parties have represented social classes in society for generations, we simply don't have here in South Korea. In addition, of course, no single party currently has a majority in the National Assembly, which severely limits the ability of the current administration to pursue its policies. And as said, there's no real culture of compromise and consensus in the Assembly. We are faced with the fact that it will be extremely difficult for the current administration to follow many of the bright ideas that have crept up in regards to the candlelight demonstrations. In fact, the Conservative Liberty Korea Party has established an internal committee to tackle the so-called political retaliation that they see by the current administration. And we cannot hence accept or expect these political parties successfully to tackle a major issue as constitutional change anytime soon. Now, both the President and the members of the National Assembly are directly elected by the people, and we do see significant popular participation in these elections. However, as the statistics also clearly show, we are on a downward trend. People are less and less likely to participate, more and more likely to participate in demonstrations that they believe that their voice has a much higher chance of being heard by that type of participation. We have also, even though to a much less degree than in the past, a serious regional and emerging generational voting pattern. If you break down the numbers from the last presidential election, it's pretty obvious that President Moon received the majority of his votes in certain regions of the country, while his opponents, Mr. Hong, received the majority of his votes in other parts of the country. Now, it's not as bad as it was when we had Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung running in presidential elections, where in one instance, more than 90% of the population of Gwangju voted for a particular candidate. But we still have a significant regional voting issue that needs to be dealt with. And there has been no, in my opinion, comprehensive, acceptable explanation on the continuation of that regional voting pattern. What we're also seeing is a generational voting pattern. The candidacy of Mr. An, of course, to a certain extent muddied the water a little bit, but the reality, of course, is that the vast majority of people in their 20s and 30s voted for the current president, while those over the 60s voted overwhelmingly for Mr. Hong. So if we're looking at these issues I brought up in the beginning, constitutional change, the reality, of course, is that changes of any constitutional near to medium-term future is remote. So we will probably also, for the foreseeable future, see presidential elections in South Korea be decided by simple plurality, very rarely passing the 50% majority when it comes to who becomes the victor. In addition, also this division of power between the National Assembly and the President, which is not necessarily the optimum division of power when it comes to facilitating governance, will also not be dealt with in the foreseeable future. The regional voting pattern, well, as said, the trend is positive. We will probably see significant improvement over time. But the reality is that if you're looking at the numbers, it is Seoul and Gyeonggi province that decide who wins the presidency. In fact, the numbers of votes that the current president got in the region we're in right now is very close to the national share of the vote he received, and the same is the case with Mr. Hong. Then we have the two other regions that for some reason still feel significant loyalties to certain candidates coming from one particular political inheritance. What the generational voting pattern that we have seen also pop up will do to that, of course, remains to be seen. Then this adversarial political landscape. I said we have 7 political parties in the National Assembly currently. Nothing indicates any type of shift towards more collaboration. In fact, the current ongoing national audit yet again clearly shows that there is no real attempt at creating a more compromised, consensus-directed political landscape in the National Assembly. And finally, the public lack of interest in traditional politics. The trend is clear. We're seeing a drop in turnouts to both national and local elections. The status, the image of politicians is increasingly going down below everything else, and there's nothing currently indicating that this will change anytime soon. So on the face of it, you should be rather pessimistic. And strangely enough, I'm not. And I'm not because I was a witness to the candlelight demonstrations. I witnessed firsthand this massive desire by ordinary people for real change. For real change in the way politics functions, for real change also in the increasing unequal economic structure. And it's my hope that this desire for real change will be continued and also have a significant impact on those what I believe are important, outstanding issues that still need to be dealt with. Thank you.